King Richard comes to Sherwood Forest. Not more than 2 months had passed and gone since the stringing adventures befallen Robin Hood and Little John, when all Nottinghamshire was a mighty stir and tumult, for King Richard of the Lionheart was making a royal process through merry England, and every one expected him to come to Nottingham town in his journey. Messengers went riding back and forth between the sheriff and the king, until at least the time was fixed upon when his majesty was to stop in Nottingham, as the guest of his worship. And now came more bustle than ever, a great running hither and thither, a rapping of hammers and babble of voices sounded everywhere through the place, for the folk was building great arches across the street, beneath which the king was to pass, and were daubing there these arches with silks and banners and streamers of many colours. Great hubbub was going on in the guild hall of the town also, for here a great banquet was to be given to the king and the nobles of his train, and the best master carpenters were busy building a throne where the king and the sheriff were to sit at the head of the table side by side. It seemed to many of the good folk of the place as if the day that should bring the king into the town would never come. But all the same it did come in its own season, and bright shone the sun down into the stony streets, which were all alive with a restless sea of people. On either side of the way great crowds of town and country folks stood placed as close together as dried herring in a box, so that the sheriff's men, halberds in hands, could hardly press them back to leave space for the king's riding. "Take care whom thou pushest against," cried a great burly friar to one of these men. "Wouldst thou dig thine elbows into me, Shera, Briar Lady of the Fountain, and who thou doest not treat me with more deference, I will crack thy knave's pate for thee, even though thou be one of mighty sheriff's men." At this a great shout of laughter arose from a number of tall yeomen in Lincoln Green that were scattered through the crowd thereabout, but one that seemed more authoritarian than the others nudged to the holy man with his elbow. "Peace, Chuck," said he. "Didst thou not promise me, ere thou camest here, that thou wouldn't put a check up on thy tongue?" "Ay, marry," grumbled the other, "but did not think to have a hard-footed knave trampled all over my poor toes, as though they were no more than so many acorns in the forest." But of a sudden all this bickering ceased, for a clear sound of many budgel horns came winding down the streets. Then all the people craned their necks and gazed in the direction where the sound came, and the crowding and pushing and the swaying greater than ever, and now a gallant array of men came gleaming into sight, and cheering of the people ran down the crowds as the fire runs in a dry grass. 28 heralds in velvet and cloth of gold came riding forward. Over their heads flushed a colour of snow-white feathers, and each herald bore in his hand a long silver trumpet, which he blew musically. From each trumpet hung a heavy banner of velvet and cloth of gold, with the royal arms of England embroidered thereof. After these came riding 50 noble knights 2 by 2, all fully armed, saving that these heads were uncovered. In the heads They bore tall lances, from the top of which fluttered pennons of many colours and devices. By the side of each knight walked a page clad in rich clothes of silk and velvet, and each page bore in his hands the master's helmet, from which waved long, floating plumes of feathers. Never had Nottingham seen a fairer sight than those 50 noble knights from whose armour the sun blazed in dazzling light as they came riding on the great war horses, which clashing of arms and jiggling of chains. Behind the knights came the barons and the nobles of the mid-country in rich silk of cloth of gold, with golden chains about their necks and jewels at their girdles. Behind these again came a great array of men-at-arms, with spears and halberds in their hands, and in the midst of these 2 riders side by side. One of the horsemen was the Sheriff of Nottingham in his robes of office. The other, who was a herd taller than the sheriff, was clad in a rich but simple grab, with broad heavy chains around his neck. His hair and beard were like threads of gold, and his eyes were as blue as the summer sky. As he rode along the broad to the right hand and the left, and a mighty roar of voices followed him as he passed, for this was King Richard. Then above all the tumult and the shouting a great voice was heard roaring, "Heaven, its saints bless thee, our gracious King Richard, and likewise Our Lady of the Fountain bless thee." Then King Richard, looking towards the spot whence the sound came, saw a tall, burly, strapping priest standing in front of all the crowd with his legs wide apart as he backed against those behind. "By my soul, Sheriff," said the king, laughing, "ye have the tallest priest in Nottinghamshire that e'er I saw in all my life. If heaven never answered prayers because of deafness, methinkest, I would nevertheless have blessings bestowed upon me, for that yonder man would make the great stone image of St. Peter rub its ears and hearken upon him. I would that I had an army of such as he." To this the sheriff answered never a word, but all the blood left in his cheeks, and he caught at the pommel of his saddle to keep himself from falling, for he also saw that fellow that so shouted, and knew him to be Friar Tuck, and moreover, behind Friar Tuck, he saw the faces of Robin Hood, and Little John, and Will Scarlet, and Will Studley, and Eleanor Dale, and others of the band. "How now," said the king hastily, "art thou ill, sheriff, that thou growest so white?" "Nay, your majesty," said the sheriff, "it was naught but a sudden pain that will soon pass by." Thus he spake, for he was ashamed that the king should know that Robin Hood feared him so little that he just dared to come within the very gates of Nottingham town. Thus rode the king into Nottingham town on that bright afternoon in the early fall season, and none rejoiced more than Robin Hood and his merry men to see him come so royally unto his own. Eventide had come. The great feast in the Guild Hall of Nottingham town was done, and the wine passed presently. 1,000 waxen lights gleamed along the broad, at which sat lord and noble and knight and squire in all goodly array. At the head of the table upon the throne, all hung with cloth of gold, sat King Richard, with the Sheriff of Nottingham beside him. Quoth the king to the sheriff, laughing as he spoke, "I have heard much speaking concerning the doings of certain fellows hereabout. One, Robin Hood, and his band, who are outlaws, and abide in Sherwood Forest. Canst thou not tell me somewhat of them, Sir Sheriff? For I hear that thou hast had dealings with them more than once. At these words the Sheriff of Nottingham looked down gloomingly, and the Bishop of Hereford, who was present, gnawed his nether lip. Quoth the Sheriff, I can tell your Majesty but little concerning the doings of that naughty fellows, saving that they are the boldest law-breakers in all the land.